It's now my privilege and my pleasure to introduce tonight's opening speaker, Dr. John West. Dr. West is Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Department of Political Science and Geography here at Seattle Pacific. He's Senior Fellow of Discovery Institute and Associate Director of its Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture. He's somewhat of a Renaissance man with wide-ranging scholarly interests in things like Christianity and American politics, constitutional law, science and public policy, and of course, C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. His books include The Politics of Revolution and Reason, the C.S. Lewis Reader's Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of Religion in American Politics, and with his wife Sonia, who's also here tonight. Where are you, Sonia? The wives need to be introduced, for heaven's sakes. There she is, right there, the blithe spirit herself. With his wife Sonia, The Theology of Welfare. Dr. West is currently working on a book called Darwin's Public Policy. His opening address is entitled The Lord of the Rings, A Defense of Western Civilization. Please give a wonderful Seattle welcome to Dr. John West.
Thank you. Nothing quite like it was ever done before, wrote C.S. Lewis shortly after publication of the first installment of his friend J.R.R. Tolkien's epic, Lord of the Rings. Lewis spoke with some authority, not only because he was a professor of literature, but because he had the rare privilege to watch the creation of the Lord of the Rings firsthand. Indeed, he had been the story's chief booster during the 12 years that it took Tolkien to write it, from 1937 to 1949. But for Lewis and his constant encouragement in private, Tolkien may never have finished his story. Tolkien himself said as much, writing a friend that only by Lewis's support and friendship did I ever struggle to the end of my labor. Once published, Lewis became the work's chief defender in public as well. The book is too original and too opulent for any final judgment on a first reading, he wrote in one review. But we know at once that it has done things to us. We are not quite the same men. And though we must ration ourselves in our rereadings, I have little doubt that the book will soon take its place among the indispensables. Tolkien, however, did have doubts, as did his publisher. They weren't sure whether modern readers would ever want to read such an old-fashioned work, let alone buy it. Years later, Tolkien would recall, "I've never had much confidence in my own work, and even now, when I'm assured, much to my grateful surprise, that it has value for other people, I feel diffident, reluctant, as it were, to expose my world of imagination to possibly contemptuous eyes and ears." Yet it was C.S. Lewis's confidence, not Tolkien's diffidence, that proved prophetic, at least as far as the reading public is concerned. When readers in England were asked to name the greatest book of the century in a survey at the end of the 1990s, they named Lord of the Rings. Many literary critics were scandalized, finding it incomprehensible that the public could honor a work that the literary community had largely dismissed as old-fashioned, didactic, and escapist. And also popular, I guess, is also probably the worst condemnation of a literary critic. I'm sorry, I'm not a literary critic, so I can say that. Yet the survey was far from a fluke. Worldwide, Tolkien's writings have sold more than 50 million copies, spawned fan clubs and scholarly organizations, and inspired music and artworks by a number of gifted artists. Tonight, you will hear a symphony by one of them. And next month, Hollywood will release the first of 3 major live-action motion pictures based on the saga. So what is so special about Tolkien's work? And why is it still worth reading nearly a half-century after its publication? Well, there are many possible answers to those questions, but tonight I would like to focus on just one. I'd like to suggest that we should read Lord of the Rings because it presents a remarkable defense of Western civilization, a defense in these dark times that we sorely need. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not claiming that Tolkien consciously created his work as a defense of the West, nor did he intend his work to be some sort of allegory of current world affairs. Allegory was a form of writing that he detested. But Tolkien himself wasn't against what he called applicability, and he did not deny that his work could be applicable to many things in the contemporary world. So in the spirit of what Tolkien called applicability, I'd like to explore how his work may be read as a defense of Western civilization. Of course, if I'm going to talk about Western civilization, I probably need to define it. That's not an easy task, for the West is a glorious melting pot of world cultures and traditions. For the purposes of our talk tonight, I'd like to define Western civilization as that civilization which embodies the confluence of Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, and pagan Northern European cultures. I freely admit that, described in this manner, Western civilization is not entirely coherent. Nevertheless, it has brought forth many good and noble things, including limited government, the rule of law, universal human rights, and a dazzling array of achievements in the arts and sciences. But in what sense, precisely, is Tolkien's work a defense of Western civilization? Well, in a literary sense, Lord of the Rings might be regarded as a defense of the West by its virtual resurrection of literary forms and themes from the West's greatest cultures. In an age when writers and artists routinely scorned the wisdom of the past, an age dominated by the anti-heroes of the literary naturalists, the nihilism of the cultural relativists, the purportedly scientific atheism of writers on the brink of suicide, Tolkien's work was like bracing alpine air, for it introduced modern readers to forms of literature that are unafraid to explore truth as well as ambiguity, beauty as well as ugliness, good as well as evil, and heroism as well as cowardice. To read Tolkien is to read more than 1,000 years of Western literature and philosophy encapsulated into one single tale. C.S. Lewis traced the roots of Lord of the Rings back to the Odyssey. Tolkien himself wrote, "I was brought up in the classics and first discovered the sensation of literary pleasure in Homer." Tolkien's mythology also draws on the Oedipus plays, the Bible, and above all, the Norse sagas. Tolkien defends the literature of Western civilization by showing his readers its breathtaking vitality. However, I'm not a literary scholar or critic, as I said before, and so I'm not really qualified to talk about this aspect of Tolkien's work. So I will say no more about it, although Professor Janet Blumberg will likely have more to say tomorrow in her talk on the literary background of The Lord of the Rings. What I would like to do instead is to turn my focus to 4 underlying themes in Lord of the Rings that I think embody foundation stones of Western civilization, foundation stones that have been crumbling during the past century. The first foundation stone is natural law. We live in an age where many among the elites have embraced moral anarchy. Morality is either relative or, worse yet, an illusion. It's dictated completely by arbitrary cultural preferences or by the non-moral process of survival of the fittest. In the words of sociobiologists E.O. Wilson and Michael Ruse, morality is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. With beliefs such as these, it becomes impossible to make public moral judgments in even the clearest of cases. Of course, the horrific events of September 11th seem to have startled even our culture makers into acknowledging that there are some things that really are evil, at least to a point. The president of ABC News was asked by journalism students recently whether he thought the Pentagon had been a legitimate military target chosen by terrorists. He replied that while perhaps, he might be able to make or take a position on that question in his private life, that as a journalist he felt strongly, at least he feels strongly about something, that he should not be taking a position on whether the attack on the Pentagon was right or wrong. Yet for more than 2,000 years of Western civilization, cultural leaders have had no such difficulty drawing what they thought were objective moral distinctions between right and wrong. From Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics to Cicero's De Republica to the writings of Paul, Augustine, and Aquinas to the documents of the American founding, the standard teaching of the West was that we could and should make public moral judgments because there is a universal moral order binding on all human beings. It was this objective moral order that our founding fathers appealed to in the Declaration of Independence when they spoke of the laws of nature and nature's God, and when they declared that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Indeed, it's this belief in an objective moral order that supplies the basis for the Western belief in universal human rights, rights that are possessed by all people, not just the blessed few in one favored culture. And it is this universal moral law spanning time and culture that permeates Tolkien's saga. Indeed, said C.S. Lewis, it provides the basis of Tolkien's whole world. Instead of supplying detailed proof of this fact, I would like to highlight one especially important passage. In The Two Towers, the character Aragorn is asked, "How shall a man judge what to do in such times?" And Aragorn replies, "As he ever has judged. Good and ill have not changed since yesteryear, nor are they one thing among elves and dwarves and another among men." In other words, good and evil are the same across cultures. There is not one moral standard for elves and another for dwarves or men. Tolkien in this dialogue seems to recall a famous passage from Cicero in De Republica, where Cicero wrote, "And there will not be different laws at Rome and Athens, or different laws now and in the future, but one eternal and unchangeable law will be valid for all nations in all times." To read Lord of the Rings is to be reminded afresh of the universal moral norms that are binding on all races and cultures. And this reminder is a ringing affirmation of the legacy of Western civilization. A second foundation stone of the West, embodied by Lord of the Rings, is the fall. From the Genesis account of Adam and Eve, to Hesiod's tale of Pandora's box, to the works of Madison and Hamilton and the other American founders, Western philosophy and literature and politics are shot through with the inevitable imperfections of man. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, says Paul in Romans. Any man who has power is led to abuse it, says Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, says Madison in Federalist 51, clearly implying that men are far from angelic. Because of the recognition of the inevitability of human imperfection, there is a profoundly anti-utopian strain in Western political thought. From the mixed government of Aristotle to the checks and balances of modern constitutionalism, Western political thought has urged the need to balance power against power because no ruler is perfect. So that one cannot abuse power, power must check power by the arrangement of things, writes Montesquieu. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, echoes Madison. Western thought has also proclaimed the utter foolishness of believing that human leaders and human institutions can somehow bring about a heaven on earth. In the words of George Washington, the best institutions may be abused by human depravity, and they may even, in some instances, be made subservient to the vilest of purposes. Even great leaders can have clay feet. Even the best motives can be twisted into something diabolical. According to Tolkien, the concept of fall was one of the three great themes in his mythology of Middle-earth. There cannot be any story without a fall, he wrote, at least not for human minds as we know them and have them. Indeed, all stories are ultimately about the fall. In Lord of the Rings, the utopian attempt to deny the reality of the fall forms the necessary backdrop to the story, though most readers probably don't realize this. In Lord of the Rings, we meet Sauron already fully grown in his evil. But you will miss Tolkien's point if that's all you know about Sauron, for Sauron was not always evil incarnate. In Fellowship of the Ring, the reader is given a hint of this when Gandalf says, "Nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so." Elsewhere, Tolkien explained how Sauron initially won over many of the elves by seeking to reorganize and rehabilitate the lands ruined by the Great War against the first enemy in Middle-earth. Sauron was still fair in that early time, writes Tolkien, and his motives and those of the elves seem to go partly together, the healing of the desolate lands. Sauron found their weak point in suggesting that, helping one another, they could make Western Middle-earth as beautiful as Valinor. It was really a veiled attack on the gods, an incitement to try and make a separate, independent paradise. In other words, Sauron sought to create heaven on earth as a substitute for the real heaven, Valinor. Thus he appropriated to himself the prerogatives of God and becomes the reincarnation of evil. Because of the fall, we cannot create heaven on earth, and if we try, we are more likely to bring about hell instead. Now, Tolkien did not write Lord of the Rings as a commentary on modern totalitarianism, but he certainly recognized that his saga did implicitly critique the utopian claims of both Nazism and communism, and the claims of inevitable progress made in the name of modern science and technology in democratic countries. Utopianism wears many disguises. It can be the ruthless attempt to impose a universal good by tyranny, but it can also be the stubborn unwillingness to face necessary evils like war. Lord of the Rings does not glorify war, but it does suggest that its profound tragedy may be unavoidable in a fallen world. When the warden of the Houses of Healing in Gondor laments to Lady Eowyn that the world is full enough of hurts and mischances without wars to multiply them, Eowyn responds tartly, "It needs but one foe to breed a war, not two." Good people cannot stop a war merely by turning the other cheek. At a more general level, Tolkien in Lord of the Rings challenges the utopian thinking that prevents one from taking sides in a moral controversy because no side is perfect. Far from portraying the conflict between good and evil as a battle between cardboard people who are perfectly good or perfectly evil, Lord of the Rings does a superb job of uncovering the conflicting and even dishonorable motives of those on the right side of a controversy. Think of Boromir and Denethor. But part of the recognition of the fall is to realize that despite the fact that no person is wholly good or wholly evil, one is still obliged to fight on the side of justice, even if one side is tainted by sin and impure motives. There are conflicts about important things or ideas, wrote Tolkien. In such cases, I am more impressed by the extreme importance of being on the right side than I am disturbed by the revelation of the jungle of confused motives, private purposes, and individual actions, noble or base, in which the right and the wrong in actual human conflicts are commonly involved. This does not mean that Tolkien thought we should be blind to evils on our own side as long as our cause is just. In fact, Lord of the Rings powerfully warns those fighting on the right side about dangers to their own souls, particularly dangers posed by blind vengeance. For all the warfare in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's epic is far more about mercy than vengeance. Mercy to Gollum, mercy to Saruman, mercy to the quisling hobbits in the Shire at the end of the story. Recall how Frodo commands in the Scouring of the Shire that there be no killing of fellow hobbits even as the tyranny is overthrown. Recall how both Frodo and Gandalf are against killing Gollum. It's not so much that Gollum or Saruman or disloyal hobbits don't deserve death. They do. It's what the taking of their lives in vengeance will do to the victors that Tolkien is most concerned about. Here Tolkien is at his most Christian in appreciating that none of us is so good that he cannot fall, and that vengeance, even in a righteous cause, is so overpowering that it will destroy us and will only lead to further cycles of violence. One need only think of the seemingly intractable hatreds in places like Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East to understand the truth of Tolkien's insight. While Tolkien insisted that Lord of the Rings was not about World War II, it is certainly true that its theme of the need for mercy, even during wartime, had a real-world parallel. Even as Tolkien worked on his epic, he wrote his son Christopher about an article in the local newspaper that seriously advocated the systematic extermination of the entire German nation as the only proper course after military victory, because, in the writer's view, they, Germans, were rattlesnakes and don't know the difference between good and evil. What about the writer, mused Tolkien? You can't fight the enemy with his own ring without turning into an enemy, he concluded. But unfortunately, Gandalf's wisdom seems long ago to have passed with him into the true West. Actually, Gandalf's wisdom had not quite departed Middle-earth, for after World War II, the Western Allies did a truly remarkable thing in the history of the world. Rather than take vengeance on the countries they vanquished, they rebuilt them and made friends out of former foes. Gandalf's wisdom can be seen yet again today as the West sends thousands of tons of food to the Afghanistan people, even as we try to root out the Taliban. Yet Tolkien's warnings about the universality of the fall and how it touches every part of our lives is something we still need to hear today, again and again. A third foundation stone of the West that can be found in Tolkien's saga is freedom. Freedom or liberty is surely one of the cardinal principles of Western civilization. It underlies much of Western literature, politics, philosophy, and religion. It's so central to the West's self-understanding that it's often debased and misused by propagandists, a fact which Tolkien deplored. Yet the cheap rhetoric of the demagogues does not diminish the power of authentic freedom. While that authentic freedom is comprised of many parts, I will highlight two. The first is moral freedom, the idea that we are not merely cogs in a cosmic machine of fate, but that we are called to make genuine moral choices, and we are therefore morally accountable for our actions. This is not to deny that there are powerful forces that often impinge on our choices, but it is to maintain that even in the midst of the forces that act on us, as we have genuine moments of moral freedom, we still do have those moments, and those moments are critical for determining our individual destinies. This idea of genuine moral freedom is at the heart of the traditional Western legal system, and it's also at the core of such great works of the West as Dante's Divine Comedy in Canto 16 of the Purgatorio. Dante writes that your free will, though it may grow faint in its first struggles with the heavens, can still surmount all obstacles if nurtured well. You are subject of a greater power, a nobler nature that creates your mind, and over this the spheres have no control. In Lord of the Rings, Frodo, Gollum, Denethor, and others all experience moments of genuine moral freedom. At the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien provides a particularly compelling account of one such moment during a struggle within Frodo on the summit of Amon Hen. Tolkien wrote this: "Two powers strove in him. For a moment, perfectly balanced between their piercing points, he writhed, tormented. Suddenly he was aware of himself again. Frodo, neither the voice nor the eye, free to choose, and with one remaining instant in which to do so, he took the ring off his finger." Time and again, the characters in Lord of the Rings remind us that we are given the opportunity to make genuine choices, and we are morally accountable for them. A second type of freedom, central to the West, is political and social. And since I'm a political scientist, you get to hear about that. The right to live one's life in accord with the moral law, free from micromanagement by either one's neighbors or one's rulers. Countries are well cultivated, not as they are fertile, but as they are free, wrote Montesquieu. The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride legitimately by the grace of God, declared Jefferson. The freedom to be left alone, especially the freedom of ordinary people to be left alone by the elites who want to rule them for their own good, is a central theme in Lord of the Rings. It's shown perhaps most clearly by the hobbits, most of whom are perfectly willing to live their quiet, boring, and mundane lives without any interference from officious busybodies, thank you. Tolkien's heart clearly was in the Shire. He even called himself a hobbit on occasion, and sort of looked like one, although taller. But even outside the Shire, one gets the idea that to be left alone to rule one's own family and one's own community was prized in Middle-earth. In The Two Towers, Eomer of Rohan declares to Aragorn, "We desire only to be free and to live as we have lived, keeping our own and serving no foreign lord." And the Company of Nine itself was supposed to represent all of what Tolkien called the free peoples: dwarves, men, elves, and hobbits, those who lived in the freedom of self-rule rather than under the slavery of Sauron's totalitarianism. They fought to maintain their freedoms, not to set up a new universal empire. True, the story ends with the ascendancy of a king, but this is a king who believes in local control, not government from the top down. Revisiting the village of Bree near the end of the book, Gandalf engages in a discussion with Mr. Butterbur at the Prancing Pony. When Gandalf informs Butterbur that there is a new king and the old highway will be reopened, Butterbur shakes his head and says, "We want to be left alone." "You will be let alone," replies Gandalf. As they continue their discussion, Butterbur accepts that the new developments will be good for business, no doubt, so long as the king lets Bree alone. "He will," promises Gandalf again. He knows Bree and loves it. The new king will not be a meddler. Lord of the Rings embodies Tolkien's passionate belief in a limited government that does not overmanage the lives of its citizens. In the midst of writing Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote to his son Christopher, then 18 and in the Royal Air Force, "My political opinions lean more and more to anarchy." Philosophically understood, meaning abolition of control, not whiskered men with bombs. Or to unconstitutional monarchy. I would arrest anybody who uses the word state, and after a chance of recantation, execute them if they remained obstinate. Government is an abstract noun, meaning the art and process of governing, and it should be an offense to write it with a capital G. Anyway, the proper study of man is anything but man, and the most improper job of any man, even saints, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. Give me a king whose chief interest in life is stamps, railways, or racehorses. Tolkien believed that government should operate within strictly limited objectives because he thought that this would safeguard genuine cultural diversity. Bureaucratic centralization, national standards applied from the top down, was deadly in his view. In another letter to his son, Tolkien expressed his fears of the world's centralization that might follow even if England won World War II. The bigger things get, the smaller and duller or flatter the globe gets, he wrote. It's getting to be all one blasted little provincial suburb. When they have introduced American sanitation, morale pep, feminism, and mass production throughout the Near East, Middle East, Far East, USSR, the Pampas, the Danubian Basin, Equatorial Africa, hither, further, and inner Mumboland, and the villages of the darkest Berkshire, how happy we shall be. At any rate, it ought to cut down travel. There will be nowhere to go. One can only wonder what Tolkien would have thought of the European Union and its growing battalions of bureaucratic planners. Tolkien's articulation of the reasons for freedom defends Western civilization by warning us of the dangers in our midst of nationalized planning, cultural homogenization, and rule by hordes of state experts who give us endless instructions about what we ought to do. A final foundation stone of the West that can be found in Lord of the Rings is a sense of the transcendent, an acknowledgement that the material universe is not the sum total of reality, and that human beings are not and never will be the rulers of the cosmic order. While the understanding of the transcendent reaches its most sublime pitch in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it can also be found in Platonic idealism, in Aristotle's metaphysics, as well as in the pagan religions of Northern Europe. Throughout Western history, the transcendent has manifested itself in many ways and many forms. It's at the root of the notion of a higher law binding on all human cultures. It's the source of the maxim that man has no right to play God. It's the foundation for the doctrines of providence or fate, the idea that human beings are not ultimately in control of the history of the universe. At a more practical level, a sense of the transcendent provides another justification for limited government, because it recognizes that man is not God, and therefore has no right to rule in the place of God. It supplies another reason to be anti-utopian, because even if we were morally perfect, which we are not, we would still be finite. We are not omniscient, and we cannot look with clarity into the future. Therefore, if we try to act as if we are omniscient, we will botch things horribly. In the words of Hawthorne, no human effort on a grand scale has ever yet resulted according to the purposes of its projectors. We miss the good we sought and do the good we little cared for. Finally, a sense of the transcendent is the inspiration for the belief that man is made for more than bread alone, the belief that the fundamental realities of the universe are spiritual rather than mechanical. The transcendent has always had its detractors in the West, of course. In the ancient and medieval worlds, it was opposed by those who thought they could invest their human rulers with divinity, or at the least with the authority of the divine. Clothed with absolute powers, such rulers could not be expected to follow the limitations of ordinary human beings. By making men gods, they denied the reality of the real God. Today, however, the chief enemy of the transcendent might be called scientific materialism, the assertion that all we are and all we believe can be reduced to matter in motion. A corollary to this claim is the belief that once we understand the forces that shape matter, we can reshape the universe to our liking. Tolkien identified scientific materialism as one of the embodiments of the, quote, evil spirit, unquote, in the modern world. By reducing all things to matter in motion, it denies the transcendent and its spiritual realities outright. And by claiming that we can discover scientific laws that will allow us to reshape human destiny, it promotes an unrelenting utopianism that has left devastation in its path. In the past, it inspired crude efforts in eugenics through forced sterilization, actually during Tolkien's own time. Barbaric experiments with techniques like lobotomies to eliminate antisocial behavior, and even Hitler's pseudo-scientific final solution. In the future, who knows? We can look forward to the expanding frontiers of bioengineering, unrestrained by the maxim that man has no right to play God because God isn't supposed to exist. According to Tolkien, the conflict in Lord of the Rings, in its most fundamental sense, is over this denial of the transcendent. It's about God and his sole right to divine honor, he wrote. The Eldar and the Númenóreans believed in the one, the true God, and held worship of any other person an abomination. Sauron desired to be a god king and was held to be this by his servants. Lord of the Rings defends the transcendent by exposing the utter bankruptcy of any attempt to replace God with anyone or anything else. It likewise opens the door to the transcendent by emphasizing the finiteness of created beings and their lack of omniscience. Even Gandalf cannot see the future exhaustively. For even the very wise cannot see all ends, he tells Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring. It's a saying that keeps popping up in the story, as does the sense that there is much more to the story than Tolkien is able to tell us. Tolkien's characters are free to make genuine choices, to be sure. But do those choices alone dictate the history of Middle-earth? Perhaps not. Early on, Gandalf lets Frodo know just how incredible it was that his friend Bilbo happened upon the One Ring. Behind that, he says, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker. In which case, you also were meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought. It is not, protest Frodo, but for the reader it is an encouraging thought, if nonetheless a mysterious one. As the plot moves along, the mystery deepens, for everything does not seem to happen just by chance or necessity. Could it be design? The Lord of the Rings does not give us a final answer, but it certainly raises the question in the minds of thoughtful readers. And by raising the question of whether there is some intelligence other than ourselves who is moving in history, Tolkien nudges readers to think about whether this may also be the case in our own lives. I have suggested that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings can be read as a defense of Western civilization, but by now it should be clear that it's also a critique of at least certain trends that have come to dominate the West during the past 100 years and more. So to say that Lord of the Rings is a defense of Western civilization is not to say that it's a defense of our civilization as it exists. Instead, it has much to tell us about the disrepair into which the West has fallen. As Tolkien would sometimes write, we face Mordor in our midst. Since September 11th, it's probably easier for most of us to believe that. Lest we have any doubts, we can still see the poisonous fruit produced by the forces of Mordor in the rubble of the World Trade Center. But what should be our response to Mordor in our midst? I think Tolkien's epic provides some guidance. Certainly part of our response should be support for military efforts currently underway. We did not seek war. War was declared on us, and now we must respond. However, Lord of the Rings suggests that the terrorists are far from our only danger. During wartime, we must of course look to the enemy without, but we also must look to the enemy within ourselves. For in a fallen world, even those fighting for a righteous cause can face temptations destructive of their souls. Two of the main temptations are embodied in Tolkien's story by the characters of Saruman and Denethor. Saruman the White was the greatest wizard of Middle-earth. He had been a tremendous force for good, and he knew it. His achievements made him proud, and in his pride he overestimated both his knowledge and his power. He came to think that he could defeat Sauron by using Sauron's methods. He optimistically believed that he could take Sauron's place and rule the world for its own good. In other words, he aspired to godlike power just as Sauron had. He blasphemed against the transcendent by denying that there were any limits that he was obliged to follow. In the end, his optimism was shown to be illusory. He was not as omniscient as he had thought. And had he been, he merely would have become another Sauron. Saruman is a warning to those who are certain, so certain, we will win over our enemies because of our superior wisdom and strength. After all, aren't we the world's leader in technology? How many computers do they have in Afghanistan, after all? Don't we have the most firepower? Isn't our economy still, even in its recession, the strongest in the world? Saruman is also a warning to those who are willing to win at all costs. The end justifies any means. Following that road, we may in fact win, but only at the price of becoming our enemies. Denethor's temptation is also born of pride. He is certain that he sees the future as well, but that vision feeds despair, not optimism. Denethor becomes convinced that resistance is futile because the future has already been decided. Denethor usurps the role of God just as much as Saruman, both because he refuses to leave room for God to act in history and because he claims the type of omniscience that only God can have of the future. Denethor is deluded into denying his own finite knowledge of the world, and this denial leads him into madness and annihilation on the very eve of victory. In their own ways, both Denethor and Saruman denied the transcendent to their own destruction. Together, they illustrate what C.S. Lewis thought was the underlying moral of Lord of the Rings: to recall us from facile optimism and wailing pessimism alike, to that hard yet not quite desperate insight into man's unchanging predicament by which heroic ages have lived. That moral is especially appropriate for us today. We do not know what tomorrow will bring. Bioterrorism, chemical attacks, nuclear annihilation. We do not know how many hundreds or thousands of Americans will die in Afghanistan or elsewhere in days ahead. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings reminds us that it is not in our power either to know or to command what will happen in the future. All we are responsible for is to go about our appointed tasks with as much wisdom and justice and courage as we can muster. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. So declared Abraham Lincoln on the eve of the American Civil War. Fortify his words with the hope of Gandalf that there is something else at work in history beyond any design of latter-day Saurons. And if you wish, add to that the comfort of Galadriel, who tells Frodo and his companions, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." For we know someone else who says those words, and his word is true. Thank you.